So if you were to look at almost like a medical x-ray of Oman's human development over the last 20 years or so, the image it produces is, well, it looks like an absolute
Oh,
miracle.
totally. It's incredibly striking.
Right, because you see this nation generating just extreme wealth and a population where the average lifespan is hitting 80 years old.
Yeah, which is
And
huge.
on top of that, there's this skyrocketing education system that has basically transformed the whole cognitive infrastructure of an entire society.
Right, the baseline stats are just phenomenal.
They are, but, and here's a massive hook for today, if you take that exact same country and apply like a planetary x-ray to it, so measuring the actual ecological cost of building that utopia, the image completely
It
shatters.
really does. The floor just falls out.
Exactly. I mean, the country plummets 69 places in the global rankings in a single stroke, which is just wild to think about.
69 places.
Yeah.
So that's the question for today. How does a nation completely ace the test of human progress, only to fail the environmental audit so, spectacularly? Well, it's really the defining paradox of modern statecraft.
hmm
I mean, what we're looking at here is a masterclass in the sheer complexity of measuring human progress.
Right, because it's never just one number. We are so glad you are joining us for this deep dive, by the way. Today, we're taking a magnifying glass to this really comprehensive 15-page data visualization report focusing entirely on the Sultanate of Oman.
And it's such a fascinating case study.
It really is. The data we are unpacking uses the United Nations Human Development Frameworks. So we're exploring this crazy trajectory of rapid modernization, the hidden structural realities of their labor markets, and finally, that immense ecological cost required to pull this all off.
Yeah, and it really all centers around that drop, that 69-place drop.
Exactly. So how does a drop like that even happen on a UN report?
Well, to understand that, we have to recognize that the United Nations, they no longer grade countries on a single, two-dimensional curve.
Right, the days of just looking at GDP are over.
Yeah. Completely over. They use a multidimensional framework now. So the baseline is the Human Development Index, or HDI, which measures health, education, and standard of living.
Okay.
But then, and this is the crucial part, they apply these stress tests to that baseline. So they look at gender parity, they look at internal social inequality, and this is the big one. They apply a planetary pressure adjustment.
Which is the PHDI, right?
Exactly, the PHDI.
Yeah.
It essentially taxes a nation's score based on its carbon emissions and its material footprint.
I like to think of it like looking at a beautifully constructed, state-of-the-art building.
Yeah.
Architecture's flawless, the lighting is brilliant, the inhabitants inside are thriving.
Right, the HDI looks great.
Yeah. But then the city inspectors arrive, they test the foundation to see if the weight is distributed equally, they check the plumbing to see who actually gets the clean water.
The inequality adjustments. Yeah.
Exactly. And finally, they walk out back to look at the massive smoldering pile of rubble and toxic runoff left in the forest that was created just to build the thing.
That is a very apt way to visualize it. And the United Nations reporting requires us to look at the building, the foundation, and that rubble all simultaneously.
But before we look at the rubble, the ecological cost, we have to fully grasp the sheer scale of the building they constructed. Because, you can't really understand the severity of that planetary penalty without first understanding the sheer magnitude of the human development miracle that Oman pulled off.
Get to that top-tier baseline in the first place, yeah.
Right. The data detailing their upward trajectory from the year 2000 to 2023 is just staggering.
It is, honestly, one of the most aggressive accelerations of human well-being in the entire UN database.
Wow.
Yeah. In the year 2000, Oman's baseline human development index was 0.707.
And what does that number actually mean in context?
So a score of 0.707 indicates a respectable developing nation. It's functional, but it is not elite. But fast forward to 2023, and that score has soared to 0.858.
Which officially places them in the very high human development tier. They broke into the top 50 globally.
They did.
And what makes that number real for me is looking at the global average over that exact same 23-year period. Because the world average moved from 0.651 to 0.756.
Right, so the whole world was improving.
Exactly. The whole world got healthier and more educated. But the growth slope for Oman is just dramatically steeper. They didn't just passively float up on the rising tide of global technological and medical advancements.
No, they actively accelerated past the global mean.
How do you even do that?
Well, the slope of that line indicates deliberate, highly concentrated state intervention. Because, you often see nations strike oil or natural gas,
Mm.
and their GDP per capita skyrockets almost overnight.
Right, the classic petrostate boom.
Exactly. But their social indicators, so their literacy rates, their infant mortality rates, those often lag decades behind. Because converting raw capital, just sheer money, into human infrastructure is incredibly difficult.
It takes time.
It takes a lot of time and logistics. But Oman managed to bridge that gap with just unusual efficiency.
And you really see the resilience of that infrastructure
Right.
in how they handled recent global shocks. Like, if you look at the UN data tracking the 2020 and 2021 global pandemic,
Oh, that's a fascinating data point.
it is because almost every nation on Earth sees this significant jagged dip in their development curve during those years. Life expectancy dropped, schools shuttered, supply chains broke.
The whole world took a hit.
Right. And Oman took a hit as well, of course. Their index dipped to 0.834 in 2021, but then by 2022 and 2023, they bounced right back to 0.846 and then 0.858.
They recovered their pre-pandemic trajectory faster than many heavily industrialized Western nations.
Exactly. Why is that?
Well, that recovery speed is the ultimate stress test of a nation's baseline infrastructure. An artificial bubble bursts under that kind of pressure. A resilient system holds.
So it wasn't just a facade.
No, not at all. It means their healthcare distribution, their emergency administration, and their economic buffering mechanisms functioned exactly as designed.
So let's dismantle this baseline index and look at the actual pillars holding it up. Because the first major driver is what the report highlights as the education explosion.
The education numbers are wild.
They really are. The visualization here shows expected years of schooling. And right now, a child entering the school system in Oman can expect to receive 13.4 years of education.
Which beats the global average.
By a lot, yeah. The global average is 13.0 years. So they are expecting their youth to stay in the system well into vocational training or university.
And expected years of schooling is a vital leading indicator. It tells us about the capacity of the current system.
Okay.
But the metric that reveals the true generational shift, the historical heavy lifting, is the mean years of schooling.
What's the difference there?
So mean years of schooling doesn't look at a 5-year-old starting school today. It looks at the actual educational attainment of the adult population currently living in the country.
Ah, so it's a snapshot of the adults right now.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the statistic that completely reframed how I view their development curve.
Let's hear it.
In the year 2000, the mean years of schooling for an adult in Oman was just 5.4 years.
So the average adult had effectively finished early primary school and then entered the workforce.
Exactly. But by 2023, that number doubled to 11.9 years. That is a 120% growth rate in a single generation.
Taking an entire national population from a 5th grade education level to essentially a high school graduate level in 2 decades is, well, it requires a logistical effort that is difficult to overstate.
I can't even imagine the logistics.
It's massive. It requires building thousands of physical schools across highly diverse terrain. I mean, from coastal cities to remote mountainous and desert regions.
Right.
It requires training or importing tens of thousands of qualified educators. But most profoundly, it requires fundamentally shifting the cultural and economic expectation of what a young person should be doing with their time.
Yeah, you have to convince families that a 14-year-old should be sitting at a desk analyzing literature or mathematics rather than contributing to the family income or, engaging in traditional labor.
Exactly. It represents a massive, deliberate release of a knowledge dividend. The state took the capital generated by fossil fuels and aggressively converted it into human cognitive infrastructure.
It's basically the most successful long-term investment the country made over the last 20 years.
Easily. And the demographic force required to move a national average that heavily is immense because the older generation, who historically did not receive schooling, continually pulls the average down.
Oh, that makes sense.
So for the youth to pull the national average up to 11.9 years means the younger cohorts are achieving near universal higher education.
Which feeds perfectly into the second major pillar of their baseline score, which is the leap in longevity. We see the same aggressive conversion of capital into human well-being in their life expectancy metrics.
The health outcomes are just as striking as the education ones.
Yeah, the data shows Oman has achieved a life expectancy at birth of 80.0 years. 80 years. That significantly outpaces the global average, which currently sits around 73.4 years.
So a child born in Oman today anticipates living nearly 7 years longer than the average citizen of the world.
Wow.
And in the realm of demography, a 7-year gap is a chasm. It's huge.
I want to explore the mechanics of this, though, because, I mean, we see rapid economic growth in resource-rich countries fairly often, right?
We do, yeah.
But does sovereign wealth automatically buy a lifespan of 80 years? It feels like simply building a massive state-of-the-art hospital in the capital city, no matter how many billions of dollars it costs, isn't mathematically capable of adding a solid decade to the lives of an entire national population.
That is a crucial distinction, and
Yeah.
you're completely right. Money does not buy 80 years of life expectancy simply through gross expenditure on high-end medical technology.
Okay, so what does it buy?
Well, you can build the most advanced surgical suites on the planet,
Mm.
equip them with the finest MRI machines, and it will do practically nothing to raise your national life expectancy average.
Because the things that drag down a national life expectancy aren't the, rare diseases that require advanced neurosurgery.
Precisely. What kills populations early, what keeps national averages in the 60s or low 70s, are systemic failures in basic public health.
Right.
Hitting the 80-year mark requires highly effective, widespread, and honestly deeply unglamorous public health distribution.
The invisible infrastructure.
Yes, the invisible stuff. It requires universal prenatal and neonatal care so that mothers and infants survive childbirth at near universal rates.
Which is huge for the averages.
Exactly. It requires a flawless cold chain distribution network to deliver sensitive vaccines to every single child, regardless of whether they live in the capital or in a really remote rural village.
Right, because if the vaccine gets warm in the desert, it's useless.
Exactly. It also requires massive investments in sanitation, clean drinking water, and even road safety to prevent traffic fatalities. To achieve an 80-year life expectancy, you do not just need a good hospital for the elite. You need a society where the baseline infrastructure of daily life protects the human body across all demographics.
Okay, so we have a society keeping its citizens alive and healthy until they're 80 and educating them at a world-class rate. They have essentially built the cognitive and biological foundation of a modern superpower.
They have.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, what happens when those highly educated citizens step out of the classroom and into the economy? Because the data reveals a severe fracture depending on whether that citizen is a man or a woman.
This is where we have to look past the baseline HDI and start applying the structural stress tests the UN provides.
Right.
Because the surface-level diagnosis looks clean, but the deeper architecture of the labor market tells a much more complicated story.
Let's examine the income gap outlined in the report. Because despite the incredibly high overall development score, the wealth distribution between genders is deeply stratified.
What do the numbers show there?
So for the year 2023, the female gross national income, the GNI per capita, sits at roughly $15,311. Meanwhile, the male GNI per capita is nearly $48,792.
That is a massive divergence.
It is. The report illustrates this with a visual of a fractured bridge showing that men are making roughly 3.2 times more money than women in the exact same highly developed economy.
And the immediate analytical instinct here might be to assume that this wealth gap is a legacy of historical educational gaps.
Like maybe the men received the bulk of that educational miracle we just discussed.
Exactly. You might assume the men possess higher earning potential in the modern labor market because they have more schooling.
But the data completely contradicts that assumption, which is wild. When you look at the Gender Development Index scatter plot, you see this incredible educational paradox.
The expected years of schooling, right?
Yes. In Oman today, women actually possess a higher expected years of schooling than men. Women are sitting at 14.1 years of expected schooling, while men are at 13.0 years.
So the young women are the star students.
They are. They are remaining in the academic system longer, pursuing higher education at greater rates, and yet they are entering an economy where men are yielding 3.2 times the financial return.
This paradox requires us to carefully untangle the difference between biological survival and economic integration, because they are not the same thing.
Right.
The United Nations gives us two different lenses to look at this dynamic. The first is the Gender Inequality Index, or GII, which primarily measures reproductive health and basic physical empowerment.
And how do they perform on that specific index?
Exceptionally well. On the GII, Oman is a global standout. Their index value is 0.222, and remember, a lower number here indicates less inequality, which places them 58th globally.
Wow, so they're doing really well there.
They are. To understand why they score so well here, we have to look at the health metrics. Maternal mortality in Oman is 17 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Oh, wow. And the global average is what?
The global average is 216.
So 17 compared to 216. The logistical healthcare mechanisms we talked about earlier, the prenatal care, the clinical access, those are functioning flawlessly for women. Giving birth in Oman is exceedingly safe.
Exactly. Furthermore, the adolescent birth rate, which tracks women having children between the ages of 15 and 19, is incredibly low. It sits at 6.0 per 1,000, compared to a global average of 39.1.
That's a huge difference.
It is. When it comes to protecting female bodily autonomy, keeping women alive, keeping them healthy, and keeping them in the educational pipeline, the state has absolutely delivered on its promise of basic human security.
But then the state delivers these highly educated, healthy women to the threshold of the modern economy, and the system bottlenecks.
Right, the funnel effect.
Yeah, the report visualizes this with a funnel graphic.
Mhm.
The top of the funnel is wide, representing women entering the workforce at steadily rising rates. In 2023, female labor force participation reached nearly 40%.
Which is a solid number for the region.
It is. But as you move down the funnel toward the decision-making exits, so the roles that yield the highest economic return and political influence, the funnel narrows drastically. Women hold only 10.2% of parliamentary seats.
What the data reveals is a structural reality that's actually common to many rapidly modernizing economies.
Okay, how so?
Well, the state invests massive capital into producing highly capable human capital. But the architecture of the labor market, the historical legacy of specific industries, and the mechanisms of political representation, they suppress the ability of that human capital to convert education into financial equity or legislative influence.
Just to be clear for the listener, we're just looking at the UN metrics here, but it really is the difference between building a door and actually letting someone walk through it.
Exactly.
The educational investment is there, the biological and intellectual potential of the female population is maximized, but the structural yield is constrained.
And from a purely developmental standpoint, leaving aside any cultural commentary entirely, this bottleneck is mathematically inefficient.
Because you have all this talent not being fully utilized.
Right. It drags down Oman's overall parity scores on the global stage because a significant portion of their most highly educated demographic is structurally prevented from maximizing their economic output.
So we see a distinct stratification when we slice the development pie by gender. But if we pivot and ask how the wealth is distributed across different social classes, the data flips our expectations once again.
It does. It's a very counterintuitive data set.
Because if the wealth isn't evenly distributed between men and women, you naturally wonder, is it being hoarded by a small oligarchy at the expense of the working class?
And this brings us to the inequality-adjusted HDI, or the IHDI. This metric is designed specifically to detect that kind of hoarding.
Let me conceptualize the IHDI for a moment, just so we have a good visual. Think of a nation's baseline HDI as the total volume of water in a city's reservoir.
Okay, I like this.
It tells you exactly how much health, education, and wealth the country has generated in total. But the IHDI looks at the plumbing system attached to that reservoir.
Right. Where does the water go?
Exactly. If all that high-pressure water is being piped directly to the estates at the top 1%, while the rest of the city's neighborhoods are surviving on a slow drip from a rusty faucet, the IHDI score plummets. It measures the loss of human development due to unequal distribution.
That is a perfect mechanical analogy. The IHDI penalizes a country if its averages are artificially inflated by a hyper-wealthy minority while the majority languishes.
So let's look at the plumbing in Oman. Their base HDI is 0.858. But when we adjust for internal inequality, the score drops to 0.750.
Right.
This represents an overall inequality loss rate of 12.6%. And I'll be honest, my initial reaction to seeing a 12% loss was to view it as a significant negative.
Sure, any loss sounds bad at first.
Right, but context fundamentally shifts the meaning of that number.
Context is everything in macroeconomic data. To understand that 12.6% loss, you really must look at the global baseline.
Which is what?
The average global inequality loss rate hovers around 20 to 22%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so compared to the rest of the world, Oman's 12.6% loss is remarkably low.
Meaning the plumbing is actually highly effective.
Very effective.
So it is not a scenario where a handful of billionaires are living to 100 with private concierges while the working class struggles to access basic antibiotics. The development pie is actually being sliced relatively evenly across different social strata.
Yeah, Oman is significantly outperforming the global average in controlling internal class inequality.
That's fascinating.
It is. It points to state mechanisms that distribute wealth with a high degree of horizontal equity across households.
Like what kind of mechanisms?
Well, in many Gulf states, the social contract involves utilizing resource revenue to fund universal public services. So when you have free, highly effective public health care, free education up through the university level, and robust public sector employment, you create a massive, stable middle class.
Right.
The average citizen, regardless of their family's historical socioeconomic status, has deeply and tangibly benefited from the nation's modernization.
So let's just take stock of the picture we have painted so far. Oman has built a society that is highly educated. Its citizens live to be 80 years old.
Right.
It possesses the administrative infrastructure to absorb global shocks like a pandemic and recover rapidly. And it has achieved a level of social egalitarianism across classes that beats the global average.
It sounds like a marvel of 21st century statecraft.
It sounds like a blueprint for how a nation should develop.
It is an undeniable marvel.
Yeah.
But, and there's a massive but, here we have only looked at the building and the foundation.
Yeah.
We have not yet looked at the rubble. We have not looked at the receipt for this progress.
And this is where we transition to the heaviest, most consequential section of the report. Because to build this desert miracle, to fund the universal health care, to pour the concrete for the schools, to lay the highways, to power the infrastructure, the ecological toll has been immense.
Massive.
We have to look at the PHDI, the planetary pressures adjusted HDI.
This is the planetary X-ray we discussed at the very beginning. Because human development is not magic. It requires energy and physical materials.
Right, it doesn't just appear out of thin air.
Exactly. You cannot build a hospital out of good intentions. You need massive amounts of steel, concrete, and uninterrupted electricity to keep the lights on and the ventilators running.
And the UN's framework doesn't condemn the use of resources, right? Like, development obviously requires resources.
Right. The question the PHDI asks isn't, are you using resources? It asks how efficiently and sustainably those resources are utilized relative to the population size.
So let's look at the ecological footprint. The data regarding carbon emissions is just staggering. Oman's per capita carbon emissions stand at 16.9 tons per year.
Yeah, that's a heavy number.
To put the sheer weight of that number into perspective, the global average per capita carbon emission is 4.5 tons. Oman is emitting 3.75 times the global average.
And we really must emphasize that this is a per capita metric. For every single person residing in the country, 16.9 tons of carbon dioxide are being released into the atmosphere annually.
That's per person.
Yes, per person. That indicates an economy with an astronomical energy intensity.
It is easy for a listener to hear carbon emissions and picture, individual citizens driving large SUVs or leaving their air conditioning running with the windows open.
Right, personal choices.
Yeah, but 16.9 tons is structural. It is the industrial baseline required to sustain modern life in that specific geography. It is the massive petrochemical extraction facilities. It is the fact that generating clean drinking water requires intensely energy-demanding desalination plants.
Exactly.
To simply have water flow from the tap costs carbon.
Precisely. The high carbon footprint is baked into the very infrastructure that enabled their human development miracle in the first place. But the data gets even heavier when we move from invisible gases to physical Earth.
The material footprint.
Yes, we have to look at their material footprint.
The report shows Oman's per capita material footprint is over 38.5 tons. Think about the physical reality of that number. 38.5 tons of earth-sown metal ores, fossil fuels, biomass extracted, processed, and consumed for every single person every single year.
It's hard to even visualize that much material.
It is, especially when you see that the global average is just 12.7 tons.
A material footprint of that magnitude tells us that Oman's development model is heavily reliant on raw physical construction and extraction. It is a highly materialized economy.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, when you are blasting vast highway networks through rugged mountainous terrain, when you are expanding deep water ports, when you are building entirely new urban centers in a desert climate, your material consumption explodes. You are physically moving the earth to build the utopia.
So how does the United Nations account for this? The report features a waterfall chart that visualizes the penalty.
It's a steep penalty.
Very. They take Oman's baseline HDI score, that elite 0.858, and they deduct an environmental stress penalty based on those 16.9 tons of carbon and 38.5 tons of material.
And the resulting deduction is brutal.
It is. The difference between their baseline HDI and their planetary pressures adjusted HDI is a massive 32.3%.
To understand the severity of a 32.3% deduction, you just have to look at the global average again. The average global deduction for planetary pressures is only about 10.1%.
So they're taking it at more than 3 times the global average.
Exactly. Oman is being penalized at 3 times the global rate because their environmental impact is so disproportionately massive compared to the size of their population.
And this brings us all the way back to the hook from the beginning of the deep dive. That 32.3% penalty is the exact mechanism that causes Oman to plummet 69 places in the global rankings when the environment is factored in.
It's a free fall.
Right. 69 countries that have a lower baseline human development score, so countries with perhaps lower life expectancies or less wealthy citizens, they suddenly leapfrog Oman on the global stage simply because they are achieving their development with a lighter, more sustainable ecological footprint.
Oman's entire developmental lead effectively vanishes under the weight of its own consumption.
It is the ultimate global accounting adjustment.
It really is. The UN framework is essentially stating, yes, your citizens are highly educated, wealthy, and healthy. You have achieved remarkable internal equity. But the methodology you are utilizing to sustain this lifestyle is generating an ecological debt that the rest of the planet is being forced to underwrite.
Wow.
It challenges the very definition of what it means to be a developed nation.
You cannot just look at a 69-place drop in global standing and shrug. I mean, you cannot maintain that trajectory indefinitely. You have to pivot.
Absolutely.
And the report lays out the strategic reality of this pivot beautifully on the final pages with a quadrant map.
Strategic quadrant maps are excellent for cutting through the noise and showing exactly where an entity stands and, more importantly, where it needs to go.
So imagine a graph, right? The vertical axis represents human development, low at the bottom, high at the top. The horizontal axis represents ecological footprint, low pressure on the left, high pressure on the right.
Okay.
Currently, Oman is stranded in the extreme upper right quadrant, the high development, high pressure quadrant. They have built the mansion, but the foundation requires burning down the surrounding forest just to keep the lights on.
And the necessary pivot, which is clearly marked by a strategic arrow in the report, is the migration to the upper left quadrant. High development, low pressure.
Which feels like an almost impossible task for a petrostate. How does a country even begin to achieve that? Is it mathematically and physically possible to maintain an 80-year life expectancy, universal health care, and 13 years of schooling without emitting 16 tons of carbon per capita?
Well, it is perhaps the defining economic and engineering challenge of the 21st century, not just for Oman, but for the entire Gulf region.
Because their entire model is built on extraction.
Exactly. Can a nation whose very infrastructure, wealth generation, and social contract were built almost entirely on the extraction, processing, and sale of fossil fuels successfully decouple its human development from carbon emissions?
And when you say decoupling, meaning the human development line continues to go up or stays high, while the emissions line bends sharply downward.
Correct. You have to literally change the underlying physics of the economy. But the report speculates on this potential, pointing toward Oman's unique geographic and climatic advantages.
Right, there is that striking visual juxtaposition in the report, the traditional wind-cooled Omani architecture sitting alongside vast, hyper-modern solar arrays.
Yes, because Oman possesses some of the highest solar irradiance levels on the planet.
So they have the sun.
They have a lot of sun. They have vast tracts of open land suitable for utility-scale renewables. And they had the capital reserves to invest heavily in green hydrogen and wind projects.
So the blueprint is there, but the execution requires rewiring the engine of the country while the country is still running.
Exactly. It requires taking the exact same administrative brilliance, the same logistical heavy lifting, and the same aggressive capital deployment that they used to revolutionize their education and healthcare systems in the year 2000, and applying all of that state capacity to an energy transition and an industrial upgrade today.
Which is no small feat.
It's monumental. They must transition from a deeply materialized extractive economy to a knowledge-based renewable-powered economy without letting the social infrastructure collapse in the interim.
It's fascinating, because if you are listening to this right now and you are interested in systems thinking, whether you are looking at how a business scales, how a community develops, or how a nation operates, Oman is the ultimate case study in the hidden costs of hypergrowth.
It perfectly illustrates the trade-offs.
You can achieve all the obvious KPIs. You can hit your targets for revenue, for health, for education. You can build the utopia. But what happens when the underlying resource model that powers that utopia becomes fundamentally unsustainable?
The bill eventually comes due.
It does. You get this 69-place drop.
It is a profound lesson in the limits of isolated optimization.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you cannot optimize one part of a complex system like human development while completely ignoring the carrying capacity of the larger macro system, the planet, that it resides within. Eventually, the macro system forces an equilibrium.
It is time to summarize this incredible journey we have taken through the data today, because we've covered a lot of ground.
We really have.
In a single generation, Oman manifested a genuine miracle. They took a nation and transformed it into a hub of world-class medical and educational systems. They took their citizens from an average of 5 years of schooling to nearly 12.
And pushed life expectancy to an astonishing 80 years.
Right. Buffering their population against global shocks and achieving a remarkable level of horizontal equality across social classes. They basically executed the playbook that every developing nation dreams of executing.
But the shadow cast by this brilliance is massive.
Yeah.
The carbon cost of this miracle is nearly 4 times the global average. The physical material extraction is staggering. And while the society is highly educated and healthy, the structural bottlenecks that prevent women from translating that education into proportional economic and political power remain a complex, deeply entrenched inefficiency in their labor market.
Which brings me to the golden quote from the very end of this report. And it is a line that delivers an absolute emotional punch after wading through all of this intense data.
I love this quote.
It reads, "True progress should not be an overdraft on the future."
That is a phenomenal synthesis of everything we have discussed.
Yeah.
And I really want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day.
Please do.
We have focused heavily on the Sultanate of Oman today. We have examined their data, their extraordinary triumphs, and their heavy ecological footprint. But apply this multidimensional framework to your own life.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Look at your own industry, your own organization, or your own personal trajectory. When we celebrate our own rapid growth, our own high performance, our own personal high human development, are we secretly generating an ecological, systemic, or energetic debt that we are keeping off the books?
That's a tough question to ask.
It is. Because when the full audit happens, how far will your ranking fall? What is your personal or organizational planetary pressure adjustment?
What a profound question to end on. A huge thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers, keep looking for the structural mechanics behind the headlines, and remember that the baseline X-ray rarely shows the whole picture. Until next time.